few military leaders hold such a lasting cultural prominence as Robert E. Lee. Even in times where the cultural tradition of the American military and its leaders have died down in our society, we can still see that such folk heroes as Lee hold a peculiar grip on our imagery of the past. This is for good reason, as Lee's career, from Mexico to Appomattox, has served as a prime example of strong leadership, as well as a great insight into the United States military of the 19th century. Robert Edward Lee was born on January 19, 1807 to parents Henry and Ann Carter Lee at the Stratford Plantation in Virginia. His father, nicknamed Light Horse Harry, was a renowned cavalry officer during the American Revolution. Despite his fame and relationships with such figures as George Washington, times were tough for Henry, whose monetary troubles kept him far from home and his family. Despite his father's misgivings, it was from these military roots that Lee's attendance of West Point Military Academy came. Lee began his military career with his attendance at West Point from 1825 to 1829. While at the academy, Lee proved himself to be a diligent and well-rounded student, receiving no demerits throughout his entire time there. Upon his graduation, Lee entered the Army Corps of Engineers, but before he could begin his service, Lee arrived home to find his mother on her deathbed. Lee's father had died previously in the West Indies when Lee was only 11 years old. Initially deployed to Cockspur Island, Georgia, Lee found more permanent headquarters at the forts surrounding Hampton Roads, Virginia, Fort Monroe, and Fort Wool. It was during this time that Lee courted and married Mary Anna Custis, a childhood friend who was a descendant of George Washington. Lee demonstrated his competence in the field of military engineering, showing his ability to lead men in construction projects that still remain today. After Hampton Roads came many dreary years spent in either St. Louis, where Lee oversaw the construction of dikes and levees in order to repair the Mississippi River's receding shores, or in Washington, D.C., where Lee did desk work for his higher-ups in the military. It was during this time that two of Lee's children were born, George Washington Custis Lee and Mary Custis Lee. These slow times soon came to an end when war broke out between the United States and its southern neighbor, Mexico. Lee, alongside many of his old classmates from West Point, departed for Mexico under the command of General Winfield Scott. Lee became one of Scott's closest aides during his campaign to take Mexico City, where Lee fought in multiple engagements alongside Scott against Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Lee earned multiple promotions as well as the friendship of General Scott due to his escapades inside and outside of battle. Lee's fighting came to an abrupt end when he was wounded in the Battle of Chapultepec. With the American victory in the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession, Lee returned to the United States, where he was appointed superintendent of the military academy at West Point. After being present at John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, as well as at the secession of Texas, Lee retired to Washington, where he was offered the command of the Union forces by his old colleague, Winfield Scott. In a letter, Lee replied, "To no one general have I been as much indebted as to yourself for uniform kindness and consideration, and it has always been my ardent desire to merit your approbation. I shall carry with me to the grave the most grateful recollections of your kind consideration, and your name and fame will always be dear to me. Save in the defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." Even though Lee privately disagreed with the Confederacy and most of their ideas of slavery, he decided in favor of fighting for his state, Virginia, rather than against it. With this, Lee had chosen his side in the upcoming hostilities. The year was 1861, and war was coming. As a Confederate general, Lee was initially disliked by the Southern press due to a string of defeats in Western Virginia and along the Georgia coastline. Lee's main prominence finally came when his former classmate, Joseph E. Johnston, was wounded in battle, allowing Lee to assume command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Yet the distrust and misliking of Lee continued, and Southern newspapers objected to his appointment to command. Little did these writers know that under Lee's command, the Army of Northern Virginia would become the most effective fighting force of the Confederacy. And so Lee began his 1862 command with a string of victories during the 7 Days Campaign and at the Second Battle of Manassas. After the Second Manassas came the inconclusive Battle of Antietam. While it was by no means a decisive Confederate defeat, it was hailed as a much-needed victory by the North. If there was any doubt in Lee's command from this slight defeat, it was erased as Lee defeated forces nearly twice his size at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, in two of the greatest victories that Lee ever fought. From this point on, things took a turn for the worse. Realizing that a victory on Northern soil was needed for the Confederacy to have a chance at success, Lee marched into southern Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. What followed was the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee's greatest defeat, as well as the turning point in the war. While Union General George G. Meade did not pursue Lee's shattered army after the defeat, the Army of Northern Virginia was exhausted in manpower and ability. Lee could not continue his offensive, and the Confederacy had to hunker down for the remainder of the war. Throughout the early stages of the war, Lee possessed the skill and leadership that the Confederate forces needed, knowing when and when not to commit his limited forces. It was Lee's military strategy that held the industrial might of the Union at bay, but in the end, it was not enough. After an inconclusive 1864, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia found itself destroyed by Union General Ulysses S. Grant after Grant's Appomattox campaign. Lee's surrender was the death knell of the Confederacy, with the end of the war coming not long after. With the end of the war, Lee was stripped of his right to vote, and much of his plantation was seized and turned into Arlington National Cemetery. Even with these actions, Lee was an outward supporter of Reconstruction and the rehabilitation of the South. Lee used his leadership and influence over the South to promote post-war peace and reconciliation. On October 12, 1870, Robert Edward Lee passed away due to complications from a stroke he suffered 2 weeks earlier. He was 63 years old. It was Lee's leadership that got the South through the war and the grueling post-war period, and it is his current legacy that inspires people from all backgrounds, military or civilian, North or South, to be willing to fight against any odds for what they hold dear.